Let's take a look at how we can put some of the directives discussed earlier into action and how they can be used in some different ways. So the first thing we're going to start off with is the ng-app directive. Now you've already seen this once in the course, but for now I'm just going to put ng-app, and as mentioned, this simply marks this as an AngularJS application. Now if you'd like to, you can come in and do something like this, but this would normally point to a module. I'll put your module here. We don't have a module that we can use yet, so we'll go ahead and pull this out for now, but later in the course we'll talk more about this. We're just going to put an empty ng-app. Now, as mentioned, you can put data dash if you'd like, and I actually prefer to do that. In this particular case, I would probably put just empty strings, but you can also get away with the normal AngularJS directives as you see here as well. All right, so that'll mark it as an Angular app. Now, what I normally like to do is make sure everything's working. You can see that an Angular script is already included, but that doesn't mean it's going to work for sure. So we're going to do an expression, and let's do 1 + 1. And what I like to do from there is run this and make sure that that expression evaluates, because if this actually displays, then we know we have a problem. So we'll run over to here, we'll hit refresh, and you'll notice that I have 2, and that looks good. So that's what we want at this point. Now, as mentioned, you can actually come in, and if I were to do, say, 2 times maybe 4 to get 8, you can also do those types of things with AngularJS expressions, and there would be an example of that in action. But you can't put logic and things like that in here. There's some basic things you can do there, but really I avoid all logic in views, especially in expressions. That's where controllers and other things come into play. Okay, so now that we have that, let's talk again about data binding. So let's do an ng model, and we'll call this name. We saw something like this earlier, and just by adding ng-app and ng model, we've now added a name property up into what's called the root scope, and now we can bind to that. So we could come next to this and write out an expression that simply writes out name. And as you saw earlier, if we just run this, anything I type will now show up automatically. And that's a simple example of data binding, because both of these are pointing to the name property, and I don't have to write all this JavaScript code, the control-oriented approach I mentioned earlier. This is a data-oriented approach. Now, the next directive I'm going to show you is related to showing and hiding. And let's say that when this checkbox here is clicked, you can see it has a little hide label next to it, that we would like to hide this div. Now, normally you'd have to give the div an ID, and you'd have to, when they check the checkbox, handle the event, then go find that ID for the div, and then handle hiding it. But with AngularJS, we can use some built-in directives to do that for us, using the data-oriented type of approach. So I'm going to come in and say ng hide is going to bind to is hidden. Now you might say, what is hidden? Well, it doesn't exist yet, so let's add that. And I'm going to come down and do an ng model down here as well and call this one is hidden. Now what's going to happen is hidden will be true or false based on if the checkbox is checked or not. So when it's checked, is hidden is true. And what ng hide will do is if this evaluates to true, it will automatically add the necessary CSS to hide the div. If this is false, then obviously it'll show it. Now there's also an ng show, so if we want to do the opposite of that, then we could go this approach as well. But for this, we'd want ng hide. So let's go ahead and refresh. Let's go ahead and click on hide, and you'll see it automatically hides that, and I didn't even have to write any JavaScript yet. So that's another directive we can use. Now switching gears to yet another directive, you'll notice that when we load the app, the name text box is empty, and we'd expect that because the name property hasn't been assigned a value. Well, let's say that we'd like to initialize this text box with a default value for name. Well, name is a property, but we haven't assigned a value to it until we type into that text box. So what I can do though is come in, and I could put this on the div if I wanted, but I'm going to put it on body here to separate it. And we can add an ng init directive. And what this allows us to do is assign the property we'd like to initialize with some data, which of course is name here. And then we can assign that equal to whatever we'd like. So I'll do James in this case. And now what's going to happen is right when this loads, once AngularJS initializes everything up, name is going to have a default value of James, which should then display, if it works, in the text box. So let's go ahead and try that out. And there we go. Now notice this is what's really cool about the data-oriented approach. By changing this, we also change the expression that you see here. Because those are tied together, they're both pointing into the same property. All right, now next thing up is, let's come down to the button here. Now normally when a button is clicked, you would call into a controller, but we'll be covering that a little later. For now, I'm going to show that there's an ng-click directive, and I can actually use this as well to change the name. So I could say name equals, and let's do Michelle in this case. And now what should happen is when I click the button, the ng-click intercepts that click event. Name will now be changed to Michelle, which should update the text box, and it should also update our data binding expression. So let's go ahead and refresh that. You'll see we have James. Let's change it, and notice it's Michelle and Michelle. And again, I've yet to write a line of code to actually identify the ID of this particular input, or to actually write the ID and handle a click event for the button. We're going to let Angular do that through directives. So that's a few of the cool things you can do. Now there's one more I'm going to show you related to data binding. I don't use it as much, but it's called ng-bind. If you have a scenario where you'd like to bind some data in, but for whatever reason you don't want to use these squiggly bracket type approach, you could also come in and do something like the following. We could say span ng-bind, and I can give this name. Now I'll go ahead and just end the span and kind of leave it like that. And what this is going to do is basically bind the value of the name into the span. And so if we go ahead and run this, you'll see that James automatically shows up because of the ng init, and then James also is bound into the span. So this is just another approach you can take, and there are a few scenarios where this might come in handy actually. I normally, when possible, prefer to go with the kind of double squiggly bracket approach, but this is another option that you could do. So you could either do this, or we could come back to what we had, and we could do name here. Now, there's a lot of other directives we could talk about, but these are some of the key ones to get you started, get you thinking, especially if you're new to this data-oriented approach, about how we really don't have to give IDs to all of our controls anymore. We can let data drive whether things are shown or hidden or perform a variety of other operations.